We are really pleased to have you here today, and as you can see from the turnout, there's a great interest in the topic of sleep. So over to you, Neville.
Carola, thank you very much. And isn't the weather grand? This would be a really nice summer's day in Christchurch, I have to say, where we do in fact get sometimes temperatures in the high 30s. In fact, since I've lived in Christchurch, we've had one day when it got 42, which, believe me, is actually uncomfortably hot. Fortunately, Christchurch doesn't have particularly humid weather, so you can endure high temperatures. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. This is despite the fact that this is where most of my ancestors came from, in fact from Belfast. This is my first ever visit to Ireland, and I'm enjoying the hospitality of Mickey and Carola and everybody else enormously. My title comes, of course, from a great speech in Shakespeare's Macbeth, where Macbeth, having killed the king, is confronted by the gravity of his crimes, and he says, "Sleep, that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labour's bath, chief nourisher in life's feast. Cawdor has murdered sleep, and therefore Glamis shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." And the disturbance of sleep that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth suffer as a consequence of their crimes and misdemeanours runs right through that great play. Unfortunately, you do not have to be a regicide to suffer from insomnia. It's a much more common problem. And what I want to do today is introduce to you what is a relatively new development, I think, in the field of understanding sleep, which is a lifespan perspective, one that runs right from infancy to old age, around a coherent set of principles which are derived from behavioural science. We'll skip that. I just want to say some acknowledgements here, in addition, of course, to the acknowledgements for the hospitality that I've received and for the sponsorship for this talk. The colleagues that I've worked with for more than 20 years in the Canterbury Sleep Project, Karen France in particular, who is really the clinical inspiration for the work that we've done, and a particular acknowledgement to Professor Dick Bootzin from the University of Arizona, who played an unwitting but very important role in what came about when we first began. Let me begin by saying a little bit about the epidemiology of sleep problems, just so we have some sense of what the scale of the problem is. This is data from a very recent study which we published in 2010. It's a longitudinal study. We followed the same cohort of babies from birth to their first birthday, and every month the parents filled in for a week a diary about their sleep. And from that data we were able to extract information about when those children started sleeping through the night, which is one of the sort of milestones that parents wait with bated breath for their children to achieve. It's like toilet training. It's really one of those big infant milestones. We actually used 3 different criteria, ranging from a relatively lenient criteria to what we call the ecological criteria, which is that to be ecologically effective, babies need to sleep through most nights from about 10 p.m. until about 6 a.m. And in fact, in order to validate that criterion, because it had never been used in sleep research before, we actually went out into malls and shopping areas in Christchurch, and we asked parents, what does it mean to you to have a baby that sleeps through the night? And they gave an answer that was very consistent with that criterion. But even with the most lenient criterion for what it means to sleep through the night, which is much less demanding than the ecological one, at 12 months, 20% of those babies were still not meeting that developmental milestone. And as you can see, the slope of those graphs levels off. So the greatest rate of change, the time in a baby's life when most babies are making the transition is actually in the first months of life. And if the baby hasn't made the transition to sleeping through, then there can be persistent sleep problems. So that's New Zealand data about the prevalence of the problem. Here's some data gathered from a very large sample, over 3,000 families that were attending a World Child Clinic in Brisbane, Australia. These are relatively stringent criteria for the presence of a sleep problem in a child. Waking 3 or more times a night, you can see the prevalence is 14% at 9 months and still 10% at 24 months. And that pattern of not much change after the first year is fairly consistent in this data internationally. And then much the same story for those taking more than 30 minutes to settle to sleep at night. It's 14% at 9 months, and it actually gets slightly worse through to the second year. So we estimate that across Western countries at least, the prevalence of infant sleep disturbance, particularly chronic waking at night and difficulty in going to sleep, affects somewhere between about 20 and maybe up to 40% of families, at least at some point during their child's first 2 years. So it's not a minor problem. What about adult insomnia? Here's data from a recent survey in New Zealand of quite a large sample, and it suggests a fairly bleak picture. Adult New Zealanders have difficulty sleeping. 20% had primary insomnia. International comparisons suggest that that's a bit high, probably 6 to 10%. Now, I haven't been able to find data for Northern Ireland, but I would predict that as a fairly typical Western culture, you probably are in this kind of ballpark. So you can expect, most individuals can probably expect to have an experience of insomnia at some point in their lives, and maybe 10% or a bit more than that may have a relatively prolonged episode. Something else to remember about insomnia is that evidence suggests by the time an adult goes to a health professional for help with insomnia, the average duration of the problem has been 10 years. Not a small problem either. The burden of insomnia is really quite great. It's experienced at the level of individuals. It's not a good thing, as Macbeth discovered, to have insomnia. It affects your relationships with your spouse and with broader family members, but it affects many other parts of life as well. And for children, it definitely affects development, and it affects schooling. There's cumulative evidence about the deleterious effects of insomnia on children's educational attainment. It's clearly associated with a variety of both physical and mental health conditions. It's particularly associated with depression. But it also has enormous economic impact through its contributions to accidents. Sleepy people have accidents, and they have accidents at work, and they have accidents when they're driving. And the estimate from countries like the US is that insomnia costs the economy billions of dollars a year. So again, we can conclude that it's not a small problem. Let me just clarify some terminology before I proceed. I'm going to talk about the top panel, pediatric sleep disturbances, which I may sometimes refer to as infant sleep disturbance, because that's the older language we started using. We switched to pediatric sleep disturbances in relatively recent times. I'm talking here about patterns of bed refusal and resistance. These are children who don't wish to go to bed, and they oppose by tantrums and by other behaviours any attempt to get them to settle to sleep. Sleep onset delay, which is the time it takes from when you're put to bed until you finally go to sleep for the first time for the night. Night waking, which is waking up and drawing attention to the fact that you're awake. It's perfectly okay to wake up if you just wake up and go back to sleep again quietly, but it's calling out and drawing attention. And possibly co-sleeping. I've got a question mark there because co-sleeping is a controversial issue, and there are some people who argue that co-sleeping with young children is very natural. Our position in our research has always been to say co-sleeping is fine if it's what the parents want to do and if it's what the culture approves of. But if you're co-sleeping with your child because you cannot get your child to sleep any other way and you'd really rather not, then it's a problem and it's worthy of some attention. There are other sleep disturbances which are often called parasomnias, and I'm not going to talk about these, but you'll be familiar with some of these. Things like night terrors, which are not uncommon among children particularly, sleepwalking, which affects a minority of individuals at any stage of their lives, and people also sometimes talk about nocturnal enuresis, bedwetting, as being a parasomnia. These are probably more directly a product of some slight abnormality or temporary state of brain functioning, rather than being associated with sort of a psychosocial explanation, which is why I'm not going to deal with parasomnias. There is, however, evidence for quite effective behavioural interventions called scheduled awakenings that actually seems to be good at dealing with the parasomnias. What I'm going to do now is actually ask Mickey if he'll come up and play the first part of that video, because this will show you, for those of you maybe who haven't had a child with a sleep disturbance, what it's actually like. And what we're going to see is a clip from a Supernanny intervention in the life of the Bullock family. And the Bullock family have a 2-year-old who is extraordinarily difficult to get to bed. And this depicts pretty effectively what life is like if you have a child with this kind of problem.